Hello and welcome back to the Age of Meaning. Thank you for joining us today. In today's episode, we discussed how consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness debunks the materialist paradigm. In the previous episode, we explained how quantum physics debunks materialism by undermining the existence of physical matter. At the bottom of all physical matter and atoms, there's really just empty space. There's a field, there's energy, there's potential, and maybe there's consciousness in a universal generalized sense. Now, in today's episode, we explored how the problem of consciousness and the fact of explaining consciousness really undermines and challenges the ordinary scientific materialist paradigm. The problem, and I think a lot of people don't know this, is that science actually cannot explain consciousness at all, and it probably never will unless it changes its methodology and its paradigm significantly. And that's what this episode is about. And so the hard problem of consciousness asks the question, how does awareness or consciousness emerge out of physical matter? Terence McKenna famously observed that science is based on the following principle: give us one miracle and we'll explain the rest. Now, he was referring to the Big Bang Theory, which is also just a theory, a speculation, a hypothesis of what happened in the beginning of the universe. But this applies equally to the question of consciousness, because science takes it on faith and assumption that consciousness just magically emerged out of the physical universe, which is ordinarily mechanistic, deterministic, and unintelligent and non-conscious, and suddenly a consciousness just emerged out of that physical universe. Now, that's fine to build functional working models of reality off of, but that kind of sloppy epistemology is not going to fly on the Age of Meaning podcast, because we're doing some serious philosophy here. So we get into some discussion, some debates. Florian also gives us a beautiful explanation of the origins of consciousness according to Erich Neumann. So please enjoy, come along for the ride. And like, comment, and subscribe, and enjoy the episode. So summing up the hard problem of consciousness very simply is asking the question, how does non-physical consciousness emerge out of atoms and molecules in the brain? So what this means is that consciousness and matter are separate categories of being. Consciousness is a non-physical thing. It's made of awareness, subjectivity, thoughts, emotions, feelings. It's not a physical object. Now, the brain, on the other hand, is a physical object. And it's a solid piece of matter. And so the brain is also part of the body. And the brain and the body evolved out of the organisms and the evolution from a little piece of organism to an ape to a human, and eventually it becomes conscious. So the question is, how does it become conscious? Where is that moment where the brain becomes conscious? So one of the things to take into account here to already establish is that there is a correlation between the brain and consciousness, obviously. So there's a correlation between parts of the brain and consciousness. There's a correlation between whether the brain is switched on or not, whether there's electrical signals going on in the brain, whether you're alive or dead, and whether someone's conscious, as far as we can tell. But the question is is there a correlation? The question is there a causation, or does the brain cause consciousness or create consciousness? And additionally to that, another way of framing it is the brain, or is consciousness literally the brain? So that's kind of implied in the scientific paradigm, is that your consciousness is happening over here in your brain. And either there's a little ghost in the machine, which is your subjective personhood, like a little man steering the wheel, your ego behind your head, or you just are the brain and you think that you're a person. So you're actually just the electrical signals in your brain. Now, science can't explain this basically. So it's like I said in another episode, it's like trying to account for how a flower can grow out of a brick. How does that work? How does a brick produce a flower? It doesn't make any sense. And so basically the current state of science, now I also wrote my philosophy master's thesis, which on a topic that covered this topic extensively. So the current state of the science on this, of the philosophy of mind and science on this right now, is that there's simply no good explanation. So it's an accurate statement to say that science cannot explain consciousness right now. And science doesn't explain consciousness, and it's a complete mystery to science. It's completely unexplained. Now, the problem with that is that consciousness is so fundamental. It's such a fundamental thing to not explain. And that's why it's such a big problem. And the reason it's so fundamental is because we are consciousness, and you are consciousness, and everyone is fundamentally a conscious being, a subjective being. So you experience the world subjectively. You're not an object, you're a subject. And science basically can't explain the most fundamental aspect of humanness and who we are as beings. That's a big problem. But there's a lot of views on this and responses from scientists about this, like one which is that one day we'll be able to explain it. One day we'll be able to explain consciousness in the brain.
Can I add two things?
Yeah. Please.
Well, one is that a Nature magazine, they make an inventory of like the biggest problems facing science, and in the top 5 is like, what is consciousness? It's like, how do we explain consciousness? It's like one of the major problems facing science today, to which there is no satisfying answer, to which there is no consensus, basically. The other one is that in terms of theories about consciousness, there's like how many, like 500 something theories about consciousness within scientific and philosophical discourse today, kind of showing the fractured nature of the way that we think about this, and that there is no unifying theory. There's no one satisfying explanation for consciousness. And we're having a really hard time accounting for consciousness, even though it's so central, because it's the very thing that kind of defines our existence, which in the scientific climate of today, there's no one explanation for. Just wanted to flag that, or emphasize what you already said about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think also there was some video that someone produced, which was like all 396 or 500 theories of consciousness explained. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the value is of studying all 500 of those theories. I mean, they're probably subtle variations of kind of main theories. But yeah, when you get into this, that's the thing, is that once you dive into the philosophy or the science of it, you realize that it's very complex, and there's a lot of reasons why it's not so simple as it may seem on the surface. So I'll touch on a little bit of that kind of points now. So one of the ways that science can deal with this problem, where it doesn't have an explanation for consciousness, and consciousness is kind of like the big mystery in the physical system. You have the physical universe, and then there's consciousness, which is unexplained. One of the ways that it can deal with it is to say that consciousness is denied entirely, is to just deny that consciousness even exists, which is called eliminativism. Basically, just eliminate consciousness out of the picture. And this is a very absurd position. It's literally insane, in my opinion. It's like actual insanity. People just say it intellectually. They don't actually believe it. Because if you believed it, then you would be saying that you don't exist, which is a rather absurd thing to say, because you do exist. And so there are theories like this in philosophy of mind, where basically the core idea is that your consciousness is an illusion that's occurring. And really, your consciousness doesn't actually exist. What only exists is your brain and the electrical signals in your brain. So your own experience of life is an illusion. And so it just denies that consciousness exists at all. So we can get into that afterwards if you want. I'm just going to continue on with this kind of bigger narrative here. So either you deny that consciousness exists, or there is a fundamental flaw in the paradigm where consciousness emerges out of physical matter, but it's unexplained. It's basically automatically it occurs. It's a leap of faith. It's basically magical thinking. To think that a flower can grow out of a brick, or that a mind can grow out of atoms that are not conscious. Either you deny consciousness, or there's consciousness all the way down and the atoms are conscious. Or there's a secret third thing, which we'll get into later as well. So the thing is, though, the reality of the situation is that science will never actually understand consciousness under the current paradigm, under the current methodology of science. It will never understand consciousness, because consciousness is not an object that can be measured, but it is what you are. And so you know for a fact that it exists. So the thing about science is that it's in the business of studying physical objects and matter, but science studies matter, and consciousness is not matter. Consciousness is not an object. Consciousness is not something you can find in the world. There's no thing that you can point to and say that's consciousness. Because the thing about consciousness is that it subsumes science. It subsumes everything, because everything is consciousness from the perspective of the scientist. So science is being done within consciousness. So how can a scientist study what the nature of the scientist is if the scientist itself is the object of its study? Okay, but I'll get into that as well in a little bit. But the point is that, they say that consciousness will one day be understood by scientists, but this is a fantasy. This is a complete cope, because unless science radically changes its methodology, or the paradigm of science changes and the scope of science changes, which it should, and it ultimately, I think, will in the future, then under the current way of science, it will never understand consciousness. So the fact of consciousness being unexplained is very, very significant, with a very significant philosophical point, which we also touched on, which is that you are consciousness. And it goes even deeper than that. So thinking back, this point that I'm about to raise, which is very significant for the argument, has been one of the most significant philosophical insights or questions to grapple with of my life, I would say. And that is that if you try to figure out anything about reality and what you know about anything, and you start your investigation from the 0 point of your experience, you will quickly realize that one thing you can never doubt is the fact that you exist as consciousness. And that everything you know and experience is and has been experienced through consciousness. And you have never experienced anything outside of your consciousness. Okay, so this is a very key point. This is basically what Bernardo Kastrup refers to as the first and only given of philosophy and life in general. And it's also drawing on Descartes' famous philosophical point, which is the cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. So if you've ever heard that classic famous philosophical statement, probably one of the most famous lines in philosophy ever, I think, therefore I am. It's actually quite misleading in the English translation because it sounds like he's just saying, I'm thinking, therefore I exist. I don't know. It doesn't really come across in the statement itself. But what he was actually doing in his meditations in that text was trying to doubt. He was kind of trying to understand. He was trying to question the existence of the external world and of himself. And what he realized, what he concluded was that you cannot doubt the fact that I exist. I cannot doubt the fact that I exist because I'm asking this very question right now, which is basically to say that I'm thinking, I'm asking this question, I exist, which means that I am. It cannot be doubted. So you know for a fact that you exist, you're conscious, you're a subjective being. And now the other interesting thing is that you've never actually experienced anything that's outside your consciousness. So everything that you experience in the world and everything you ever have experienced has occurred within your mind. It's been perceived through your consciousness. And so it's been experienced through the medium of consciousness. Now, the point, this is also what leads, this is one of the premises that leads to idealism, which is the view that consciousness is primary. But for now, I'm just emphasizing this, I'm just flagging this to highlight the significance of the fact that science can't explain consciousness and why this is such a big problem. Because actually, consciousness is very, very, very fundamental to existence itself. It cannot be explained away, because if you do that, you're basically denying the fact that you exist, which is insane, because who would do that? Doesn't make sense. And the first and only given fact of experience and the methodology of science means that it will never be able to find it, because all of science is happening within consciousness in the first place. All thoughts, all perception ever, including science, is consciousness and is happening within consciousness. Okay? So consciousness is the container that science is happening in. Consciousness is doing science. So this is why science will never be able to find consciousness as an object in the world and prove that it's the brain, because the brain is an abstraction. The problem is that this is a paradigm-breaking insight. Materialism cannot account for this. Either reality is material all the way down, or it is all consciousness all the way down, or it contains both consciousness and matter. This means that there must be two fundamentally different parts to reality that somehow interact. But that position collapses under its own weight. If the physical world is causally closed, then consciousness cannot affect anything physical, which makes it epiphenomenal. And if consciousness can affect the physical world, then physics is incomplete, and we need an explanation of where and how that causal influence enters the system. Either way, dualism fails to bridge the gap. It cannot explain how two ontological kinds with no shared properties could make contact.
Can I quickly interject?
Please do.
Because I'm just trying to grasp the argument and I'm sort of visualizing it, where I imagine like you have the world of mind. It's like our consciousness as we experience it as human beings, which exists next to or that's sort of, you can put that next to then our physical brain, let's say, or our brain and our nervous system. And you could make the argument that the mind, the consciousness, is produced by the complexity of the material brain and the material nervous system. And it's because that has evolved into a certain amount of complexity, it produces this consciousness. It's somehow capable of that. And there's still no explanation for how it's doing that, but that's kind of like that image that emerges. And you can imagine we have evolved to become this complex, and therefore we have that type of brain or consciousness or mind. And you can imagine that previously in our evolutionary process, it's like the consciousness becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. but there's always already sort of, some level of consciousness all along the way. It's like in plant life, for instance, or in animal life, and there may be a certain level of consciousness or a certain level of mind, but it's not of the same scope as it is for human beings because it hasn't evolved to be that yet. So earlier in the evolutionary process, there's less complexity in the biological organism, and therefore there's less of a mind or a consciousness that becomes present. So it's like these two worlds, that's like the dualistic image, right? There's like consciousness on the one hand, and there's the material substrate on the other hand, like the physical body, the biological organism. And you can think along a timeline that like complexity evolves on the material plane and the scope of consciousness evolves on the sort of consciousness plane. And those two are sort of they unfold in a synchronous fashion. And that if you go back all the way to the beginning, there's like a fundamental element of both is already present. So that's the idea that like, well, there has to be some amount of consciousness. If consciousness ever is like, either it's the case that there is material, just a dead material universe that's not conscious, that's just simply material, and that becomes complex enough to somehow magically render consciousness. Somehow in some configuration of matter, poof, there's like consciousness emerges. It's more, I think it's more plausible that it's like a gradual process, you could say. And then, well, you can also argue that there must have been some elementary form of consciousness all along the way that just expanded and grew. But then you still maintain the dualism, right? Of there is both matter and consciousness, and they're both real. It's just they've always been together, and that's just the way that the universe works somehow. But then you come to the realization that actually that material substrate that you imagine sort of increases in complexity, that very thing is actually the only thing that you are inferring. Because the mind, the consciousness part of it, that's actually your direct experience. So that's already there as an evident, sort of a self-evident fact, as just a phenomenon that you're experiencing, that is undeniable. And within that, you create this idea of a material universe that's actually held within your conscious awareness, within your mind. And that's what you see, that's what you think you see out there, but the out there is really also held within consciousness. So there's no way around the conscious part of it. And the material part, even though it seems very self-evident, or it seems very commonsensical that, there's a material reality out of which consciousness emerges, or which exists alongside consciousness. That in itself is sort of a second step, because it's an idea within consciousness. Is that, like, do I summarize that correctly?
Perfect, yeah. Exactly. That's also what I was that's also Bernardo Kastrup's, it's the hinge of his whole of worldview, his analytic idealism, which is that, and by idealism, by the way, idealism means it's a worldview where consciousness is primary, where the universe is fundamentally made of consciousness. One way of saying that might be that at the bottom of the quantum field, what you have is some form of consciousness, something more along those lines, some sort of form of generalized universal consciousness, which is actually at the base of reality, which is then manifesting itself as matter. That's what idealism means. But yeah, so he says that because you know that you're conscious, you know for a fact that consciousness exists, and all you've ever experienced is consciousness, then to infer that there's something called matter, something physical matter which you don't see, physical matter which you don't experience, because this is the other wrinkle to the thing, is that you might be listening and thinking that whenever you touch your table, you're touching physical matter and you have direct evidence of matter, but you actually don't, because all you have is the phenomena, the experience of touching the table. You never get out of the experience. You're always perceiving things through the five senses, which is the really weird thing, and this really interesting thing to ponder. But so from there, to infer matter exists is actually a leap of faith. It's an inference that you don't have direct evidence for, and you have to basically speculate that there's something out there which is different to what you know exists. It's a different order of being. It's like physical objects. Meanwhile, you're a mental subject, and so that's a problem. So it makes more sense to infer that the world out there is also made of the same fundamental substance, just arranging itself in a different form, according to Bernardo Kastrup. And that is one of the alternative ontologies or metaphysics or worldviews that is being presented at the moment, which is gaining a lot of popularity in the world, that provides explanations for all of these problems of materialism that I've listed, especially the problem of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a little challenging to really grasp, everything that you just explained in a sort of a coherent way, because there's a lot of different ideas that kind of go into that.
Mm.
So I feel like I kind of need to digest it a little bit more, like basically what you're saying. So what was the first point you made? You started out saying that basically within science there's no explanation for consciousness. Like the hard problem of consciousness means that, well, there's no way for accounting for the fact that consciousness emerges if you assume that reality consists of sort of a physical observer independent universe, and that out of this physical universe then consciousness emerges. That's the problem, that there's no way of accounting for that. And you said
Yes.
that like there's also a problem of the relation between the two. Like, how can it be that something which is categorically different, it's like a fundamentally different thing, how can that emerge from how can the one emerge from the other, right? It's like a flower emerging from a stone. How is it that the material dead universe somehow in some configuration produces consciousness? That's like a magical thing. That's like a mystery, complete mystery, how that would ever happen.
Yes.
Because what it produces
And
is something that's fundamentally different. Its consciousness is something that, it feels like to be something. It's like you're an embodied, you're a being, you're a living being with an awareness, with a lived experience. And it's like, how is that produced by a material body? Because you can imagine, like, if you have a material body and everything that's happening in the material body is just mechanistic, it's like, it's deterministic. So it's just working like a mechanism, like a clockwork, where there's all these causal relationships between all the processes that are going on in the body. It's like a mechanism. And it's basically deterministic because a cause produces an effect, and that's always just going to happen like that. Then it could be an organism just functions and does what it does without having to be conscious, without needing to be conscious. There's no need for consciousness. So in a way, you can have that whole model and it can work like that. But then, like, why is there consciousness? Why does there need to be consciousness? And how can you explain for the fact that what we're experiencing is consciousness? So that's, those things are sort of part of the hard problem, as I understand it, right?
yeah,
And then
absolutely. I'm so glad. Okay, continue.
well, and then the idea is like, how can they affect each other? How can the mind have an effect on matter? That's also, so it works also the other way around. It's not just how can matter produce consciousness, but also how can consciousness have an effect on matter, cause anything to happen within these material processes, mechanistic processes that are going on, which is just cause and effect. How can something that's, operating in a completely different domain of what's real affect that, right? What is the causal mechanism through which a mind affects a material process, a material, mechanistic, deterministic process that's going on? That's also something that science has no satisfying theory to explain, right? So those are the three major points that I got from what you.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm really glad that you raised that, because also one thing that I'll add, which is a huge point, just on the point of science and academia and how human beings work, it's the fact that we don't understand these things. Like you said, it's a complete mystery. We don't have an explanation for how consciousness emerges, or what it is. But despite that, we assume that we understand it, and we act as if we do. And all of science, all philosophy of mind that takes this materialist slant basically works on the assumption that consciousness is produced by the brain. Now, so this is the assumption that operates, but it's not proven. There's no evidence for it. So it's a belief without evidence. Okay. So this is the crazy thing, because you would think that science is so rigorous and science is so logical and rationalistic and based in evidence. But really, when you go and you look at the current, well, not the cutting edge, but the last like 3 or 4 decades of philosophy of mind and science of consciousness, neuroscience, now the paradigm has changed in the last decade or so. But before that, what you find is that everyone is arguing for these views of consciousness that just take for granted that it's produced by the brain and that it's produced by physical matter. So you take that assumption and then you build all these theories based on it. But really, it's just a house of cards.
Yeah.
You've built your whole theory on an unproven piece of evidence, which is really scandalous and shows how sometimes bias and untruthful science can be in the pursuit of maintaining the paradigm or what's convenient or what people want to believe.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting argument which exists sort of next to what you're saying about consciousness and sort of the debate on consciousness and debunking materialism is sort of how science works. And it's like philosophy of science or even sociology of science. It's like science as it should work in its pure form. You would sort of imagine that as a scientist, you're just working with the data, you're just analyzing the data, and the data suggests certain things to you, and based on that, you make a theory and you work with the theory, but you just do that based on what you're studying, what you're doing research on. And what's beyond that, you basically remain agnostic on. So you basically don't form any theories that are not based on your data. And that means that you're very limited, but it also means that those theories that you do end up developing have a lot of weight, right? Have a lot of validity because you're being so rigorous in your approach. It's kind of like that's the pros or the benefits of the scientific method, right? It's very rigorous and then it has a lot of validity if you do it carefully. And like all of science is basically training you to be as careful and rigorous as you can be so that you can
And
be as
neutral and
certain as
objective.
possible. Yeah, neutral, objective, exactly. And it's like it's without any values. You're just looking at the facts, at the data, and then you're coming up with the best theory, which in principle also always needs to be able, it needs to be falsifiable. So that's also a core part of science is like when new data shows up, you keep testing your theories and new data starts to disprove the theory, then you have to correct the theory. And so in principle, when science operates as such, it's a very, very powerful tool that can give you a lot of certainty about the way things work. But the reality is, this is not how science works, because science is actually executed by human beings, and human beings cannot operate in this sort of neutral, stripped down, scientific mindset without still being a cultural and social agent, without still having their own psyche, with its own biases, without still operating within a culture where there are certain assumptions that are so deeply ingrained because we're historical subjects. We exist in this historical culture, and some of these assumptions about the nature of reality are so deeply ingrained that they're simply unquestioned, right? And that is actually what is the paradigm, that we're a part of. The paradigm is so fundamental, it's so accepted so unquestioningly. It's like it's just a common sense understanding of reality that at that level, those assumptions are not being studied, or they're not being thought about, or they're not being scrutinized with the level of skepticism and objectivity that is applied within the higher level scientific enterprise. Whereas if you would actually expand the scientific mindset to actually be truly skeptical and to really doubt, like the real philosophers do, for instance, then you would come to see that like some of these most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, which are informing the worldview of these scientists, itself actually falls down under scrutiny. And that, when you bring it all the way back down to, what you can really postulate with certainty, then, it becomes much more limited. And then you see that actually a lot of these things that we take for granted are no more than assumptions, are actually not scientific in a way. They're actually part of our bias, right? Just our natural intuitive assumptions about what's true. And we think it's so self-evident that we don't even consider to look at, what evidence there really is for it, right? Because it might actually be a false assumption.
Yeah, and I think this is why science, there's a big problem in science, which is the lack of philosophy, basically. The lack of philosophy of science, because philosophy of science is a big domain. And that's what Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution is. It's philosophy of science. And because it was meant to be that science is a part of philosophy. The science used to be called natural philosophy when it first emerged. And so it was like the study of nature and stuff, but it was within the set of philosophy. So the problem is that science doesn't, like a scientist ordinarily, unless they're a brilliant scientist, they won't question their own epistemology. They won't develop their epistemology and be aware of their epistemology. Epistemology, by the way, means the theories of knowledge and how you know what you know, which is exactly what you were just saying. Like, you have an assumption of how the world is. It's an assumption, and you don't even realize that it's informing what you're thinking about the world and what kind of studies you're going to do, what kind of science you're going to do. and how you're going to interpret the results. Or when you have a theory of consciousness, you're going to say the brain produces consciousness, XYZ, and you develop a whole model, but you haven't even proven the first assumption that the brain assumes consciousness. There's no evidence. Brain produces consciousness. So that's the epistemology aspect. And if the scientist doesn't do epistemology, then them as a human, as a scientist, is not actually neutral and objective, and they're just being paradigm laden. So that's also what you were describing. Is Thomas Kuhn's term for it is paradigm laden, where you can say that like this scientific work is paradigm laden, where it doesn't even realize, but it's got the paradigm, the background assumption, the mainstream beliefs laden in its theories, in its thoughts, and in its assumptions. And that's what a lot of science is like. And this is why the paradigm shift is happening, and it is happening. It's happening in philosophy of mind, and it's happening in science with quantum physics, and that's, because now the worldview about science is changing. It's just that these things are so significant, and can be so counterintuitive that they take long to filter down into the general society and science as a whole. So science knows that matter has no solidity and that there's quantum entanglement. This is known, it's not denied, but it doesn't filter into scientism, and it doesn't filter into the general mainstream understanding of science or what they teach kids in school, because I don't know, maybe I guess because it's too radical and it's not really understood yet. But yeah. Now, one of the other points about consciousness, which I think is interesting, which is a bit more subtle, I guess, or more kind of meta. I don't know if it makes sense necessarily. I mean, it feels like it makes sense intuitively on like a deep level, but which is the fact that all science is done within consciousness in the first place. So all thoughts and all perceptions ever, and the whole enterprise of science is a function of consciousness. If you just think about that statement and analyze it, if you just analyze that statement, it's true, because once upon a time there was a human being, a mind, who had the thought of science and decided to start doing science. Science started emerging in other minds. And whenever a scientist does an experiment, they look in their telescope or in their microscope, they're looking with it from their consciousness, and then they write a paper, which is their consciousness writing a paper. Well, the whole science is contained within consciousness in the first place. So science is trying to understand or study consciousness, but in reality, consciousness is doing science. And so it's subsumed in like the air that it breathes. Like you can't, it's like that Alan Watts quote, how can you bite your own teeth? How can science actually understand such a fundamental thing that it always is? And that's part of the assumption of science, part of the paradigm, is that it assumes that everything that it's studying is going to be an object or a physical thing. Something that you can observe, you can cut it open. You can take a brain and cut it open and point to the place where consciousness is, but it doesn't work like that, because your consciousness is your awareness. You can never find
basically
the awareness.
what it means is that whatever science is, whatever scientific theories we have, or whatever is part of the scientific process in terms of its methods, like how science is done, at the bottom line, they're all ideas. In essence, they're just ideas. They're ideas that are being communicated, through scientific journals and papers, and people read, because these ideas are expressed in language, so they can be communicated. But in the end, at the bottom line, they're just ideas that are held within our minds. Now, the thing about science is that they're not just like any other ideas, because they're very non-arbitrary. Like a lot of ideas or theories can be very arbitrary. It's like somebody just came up with something and they claim that to be a truth. And they're like, yeah, this is true. But then other people can say like, well, I don't agree with that. I don't see that as a truth. And like the scientific-minded person has decided to not latch onto any arbitrary ideas for which there are, always sort of reasons for and against, but to only put their faith, so to speak, in those ideas which actually came about through this rigorous process of the scientific method. And so they're not arbitrary ideas anymore. It's not an arbitrary idea. It's an idea that came out of the data that we analyzed. We see data, we analyze that, and then that suggests a certain idea. It's like, I didn't come up with the idea. This is what the data suggests. And then it carries more weight. It's more like, it seems more true. But at the bottom line, they're also just more ideas. They're nothing but ideas in a sense, right? That's basically the point you're making, right?
Yes. And also that you can't find consciousness in the world, because it's not in the world. It's more fundamental than that. So it can't be found. But that is also the point that I'm making. And I think it's also good to, on another, what you brought up earlier also reminded me of my philosophy of cognition course at the University of Amsterdam, philosophy of mind/cognition. I mean, they called it philosophy of cognition, which already revealed the bias of that particular course and that lecturer, because that lecturer took a materialistic view of consciousness. So he called it cognition instead of philosophy of mind, which is what it's normally called. But so some of the things that you learn there is that some of the leading theories of consciousness for the last couple of decades has been computationalism, for example. And computationalism is not without no reason. I mean, it's not without reason. There's a reason why people think it. So this is the view that the mind is basically like a computer, that your brain is like electrical signals, and it's like a computer that's rendering software, which is your experience of consciousness. Okay. It's also interesting that, this theory emerges now at this time in history when all of a sudden there's computers everywhere. So now everyone's like, well, I'm looking at a computer all day, every day. Wow, there's hardware, there's software. Okay, I must be a computer. It makes so much sense. But I mean, it didn't exist any time before computers, this kind of thinking in the exact same way. But the problem with it is that it's based on, when you actually get into the details of it and you read the actual philosophical scientific papers and you get into the details of it, what they're saying is that there's electrical signals in the brain that are going on. And what these electrical signals are is they're basically binary code, basically binary signals, like yes and no signals that are happening. So the brain is made up of many complex, like, messages being sent from one to another. And so there's basically these binary code. There's binary code that's going on. So this is the syntax and semantic problem, which is that you can see the brain as a computer where there's like literally code. There's like A B A B A B, lots of binary code, and eventually it gets complex enough that it becomes meaningful and semantic, and that this code, which is like numerical, like electrical signals, just electrical signals. That's it, just electrical signals. That somehow that becomes complex enough to produce meaning and consciousness and semantic intelligence out of this syntax. So that theory, when this is like on the ground, this is like the details of how the theory of theorizing of how the brain produces consciousness, and it just falls apart. It doesn't make any sense. And there's also the
Why?
problem of, well, because then you're reducing the experience of being human and consciousness and subjectivity to an A B binary signal, and many of those, just many lots of little A B signals that are like yes or no binary code. It doesn't explain. It's just the leap is too big. It's a magical leap to explain how you get from a machine that's like got these like little, like you're turning on a light, like the light's like electrical signal on, electrical signal off, and there's like billions of these electrical signals going on, and that just somehow produces the subjective experience of everything. Is your awareness, your subjectivity. Doesn't that seem fundamentally unintuitive? That really what it's reduced to is just like electrical, like an A/B switch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, might be like not so romantic, but I don't immediately see why it couldn't be true, right? Why that theory should be refuted, or why it's not a valid theory.
Well,
There
because
are
there's
interesting
nothing.
implications to it. Like the implication is that a computer, in principle, could also be conscious, or maybe even is conscious, right? Like an
Yeah,
AI
but
system,
that's part of.
which consists of that same computational process, could produce consciousness just as our brain is doing it. That's one implication that it's interesting.
Yeah, I know that's part of that. That is exactly what was part of the course, which was that computationalism and AI. And so, but the problem is that it's the same thing where it's built on the assumption that consciousness is in the brain, but there's no evidence of that. It's the assumption, and so it's a theory. It's a theory. It's a hypothesis with no evidence. It's paradigm laden. And so the thing is that you're reducing consciousness, which has there's no quality of consciousness in like the experience of a binary code. It's just one thing, one signal. There's there's literally nothing that it is like to be consciousness that is found in a binary code. There's literally nothing. So it's the what happens is that there's an explanatory leap which is basically saying that it automatically becomes consciousness. So this is the same argument, but I'm just getting, this is the actual details of these theories. And so that's the thing. So it's syntax. So it's like a calculator. It's like saying that a calculator can just become conscious, but there's no, so taking the assumption that it's physical, that it's in the brain, and that it automatically becomes conscious. So that's the leading theory. There's a magical leap. It's like a leap of faith. It's like magical thinking. There's no explanation. There's no part where all the signals come together and they start forming like the emotion of love, or they start like forming like perceptual awareness. Like that, none of that exists. It's just a leap of faith. It's just a theory.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, we move on from consciousness. It's a tough one. I think the fundamental argument about consciousness is that your consciousness. That's the fundamental important thing. And to explain it away or to just reduce it without evidence is a big, big leap. It's a big problem at the very least. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, which you already said before, is then you're making a decision in a way to accept a certain view of reality where what you accept as the primary and more real thing is the material brain, despite the fact that the material brain itself actually is nothing more than an idea held within your consciousness. But you're just ignoring that fact, and then you're choosing to see that brain, which is an idea in your consciousness, as a thing that's actually the more real, the very real. And then from that assumption, you're going to explain, or you're going to bridge how, that produces the very consciousness within which that idea is held, and it's just a contorted approach. And it's not like I don't think you can immediately disprove that, but it's a theory that, you can work with that theory. You can basically make that assumption. Anybody is free to make any assumption about the way reality works at this level. But it's false to claim that has some kind of superiority in terms of its truth value over alternative theories about consciousness, or about what reality what is primary, what is the primary substrate of reality, physical or non-physical. That's where it becomes problematic, right? When somebody says like, well, this is the truth, or this is the more true explanation.
Yeah.
Because in a way,
and
it actually, you're just
granted.
That is arbitrary. That's where it becomes arbitrary. And the very thing about science is that it's supposed to not be arbitrary, but these things are actually arbitrary, right? And they're just assumed, they're taken for granted. That becomes part of our bias. That's part of the paradigm that we're in. But it seems so self-evident. It's like, yeah, of course the brain is real. Of course the physical body is real. And yeah, that's what we're working with. That assumption is like, that's the kind of the starting point, taken for granted as such.
Well, for us in our culture it is, but not necessarily in other cultures or in other times in history. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think that's the key point that can be said at the very least. And there are stronger cases to be made against it with the consciousness thing. It's a very complex thing, as I was saying. But I mean, a key point is that you take the assumption that the brain is consciousness or produces consciousness without evidence. There's no evidence for it. That's the key point.
Yeah.
This is unscientific. There's no evidence.
That's right.
Okay. And then that's used as an assumption. And then lots of science is done with that assumption. No evidence for it.
It fits into our established paradigm. It sort of reaffirms all of these other things that we're assuming about reality. And that's why it's sort of comforting, and that's why it has a certain appeal, right? That's why people are persuaded by that type of argument, and they buy into that. And they actually are inclined to take it as self-evident, even though it's not necessarily self-evident.
Yeah.
And it's good that that's actually being exposed for what it is, because people often use that type of reasoning to kind of claim some kind of position of, epistemic superiority. And it's like, actually, well, if you're more true to the spirit of science, so to speak, if you want to be rigorous and systematic, and you want to have some, what you can call epistemic humility, like you don't just make claims that aren't founded on something that's, objective, then, that's good that that's being called into question or exposed for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and I think, yes.
No, maybe you want to respond to that?
Well, I was gonna say, since we're doing serious philosophy here, I would also maybe flag that I can really anticipate their objections to the listeners, which is that somebody's gonna think, this is a classic thing, is that we said there's no evidence that the brain produces consciousness, and somebody's gonna say, well, if I hit you in the head with a hammer, your consciousness goes away, and so there's evidence that your brain is like, there is evidence. What do you mean? Because if you die, your consciousness goes away. If you get brain damaged, your consciousness is altered, and you can observe different parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex having different relationships with different things in the mind. So that's one critique. I'm just going to flag that. We don't have to get into the whole thing, but this has been thoroughly dealt with by people like Bernardo Kastrup. You can check out their arguments about it if you want to get deeper into it. But basically, the key point is that there's a correlation between the brain and the mind. No one is disputing that. So no one is disputing that when you do cognitive science and we're understanding the brain, we are understanding something about the mind, and we are understanding something about what the mind is and why there is a brain. So the problem is that there's not a causal relationship between the brain and the mind. The brain doesn't grow out consciousness. Like, what the other position is that consciousness is primary and the brain is coming out of consciousness. Just like Max Planck said, which is that he regards consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So if you don't assume the materialist paradigm, then you can explain the relationship with the brain in another way. So that's all this requires to avoid this problem, is that you don't take the materialist assumption for granted. And then you say, how come when you hit the head with a hammer, then your consciousness changes? It's like, no, there's a correlation. And the reason that the brain is there is because of other hypotheses. The original one is a hypothesis first with no evidence, the materialist paradigm. And then you could have another hypothesis, which is that consciousness is fundamental and that somehow the brain is the way that consciousness is kind of solidifying itself into this form of a more dense form of consciousness. And so that's what the brain is. And there's a relationship between the brain and consciousness. But it's not that the consciousness is reduced to the brain. It is puzzling.
It's still puzzling, right? It's still puzzling. Like, how is it that, consciousness, solidifies into the structure that we then observe as a brain, which then, functions in a certain way, which is correlated with the phenomenal experience of consciousness. It's just as puzzling in a way. It seems just as puzzling as this question of, like, how would the brain produce consciousness? But the only fundamental and important difference being that actually within that view where you say like consciousness is primary and it just configures itself in certain ways that then appear to us as materiality, the argument in favor of that view is that actually then there's just one substance. There's just one substance, and the substance is mind, is consciousness itself, or mindness, sort of mind, which is more than our individual mind, our individual awareness, which is just a limited manifestation of that. That's sort of what you can say in favor of that theory, so to speak. Just like that there is just there's more simplicity to it. It's just it consists of the one substance, which is mind, which is not a substance in a way, or it's but that's the category in which you're explaining the way reality works, as opposed to the materialist view where you have two fundamental substances. You have mind and you have materiality as a thing that exists on its own. And then you have this problem of like, how did mind emerge out of materiality? How does mind engage with or have an effect on materiality? And in a way, those are problems that seem more insurmountable than the problem you have with sort of how does within a universe that consists of mind actually things get configured in this very particular way. Is that, can you follow my line of thinking?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point that Bernardo Kastrup makes, who he's kind of like at the moment on a contemporary, a leading philosopher in this field. So that's why I'm referencing him a lot, because he's really been groundbreaking with his arguments in this, I would say, in an analytical, modern scientific analytical language. But so his point is that to make the materialist assumption actually is a leap of faith that has no evidence. And so it fails in the first step, basically, and in many other steps. But the first step makes it philosophically untenable, which is that your mind, you don't know that matter exists. You assume that matter exists. You take a leap of faith. Kastrup also gives an analogy of a kind of an explanation, a loose kind of analogy of how the brain and consciousness might be working. Now, this is also far out ideas. Like this is far out theorizing. But so it's also, but on the other hand, though, it's also very, very common in world religions, in world history, and world philosophy. This idea of consciousness being primary and the world being one. So that's not a foreign idea to mankind, but it is to our culture. But so Bernardo Kastrup says that it maybe functions like this: you have a river, which is generalized universal consciousness, and the way he defines consciousness is that it's something like, he calls it the phenomenal consciousness, which means that there's something that it's like to be that thing. So there's some sort of pure, raw, like sense of experienceness, some sort of thing which is like the base, pure level of consciousness which exists. And so there's general, universal consciousness. It's not specific, it's not local. And there's like this river going down in the analogy of pure, general, universal consciousness. And then there's little streams within the consciousness and little ripples within within the river. So let's say there's a ripple going on inside a river, and there's like a little ripple going on. And inside that ripple, like a little vortex of water, that's just where that water has just coagulated for a second. And so that's how he explains the brain and the physical body. So the brain and the body are how consciousness localizes itself into this particular form and takes this perspective of a single point, a single localized piece of consciousness. And it dissociates itself from the rest of the universal consciousness. And so it's like a little vortex or a ripple within a stream. And it's just an arrangement of that substance into a particular form for a moment. And then the form fades away back into the river, which I think is a pretty interesting thought.
I would like to throw up one idea or one way of sort of visualizing this. And then I think that maybe we should round it off as the part one of a two-part episode. And that in part two, we can continue the conversation and you can go into your third point. Because I think
because I actually
otherwise
see
it
quite a
will
lot
get
here.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to do it justice, but it will become a very long episode. And I have to go at some point, so I don't have the time to just keep going.
Okay.
So
sounds good.
I wanted to suggest that. So
yeah, that sounds good, because this.
Then I wanted to throw up one last idea, and then yeah, exactly. I wanted to run an idea by you and see what you think about it, see how it fits in. This is an idea I got from reading a book by a Jungian scholar, so somebody who was actually a direct student of Carl Jung, but then went on to, develop his own theories. And he ended up writing a book that actually Jung said about this book that it's the book that Jung always wanted to write, but never managed to write in one book. It's a book I would highly recommend. I've read it twice, but it's been a while, so I'm going to be paraphrasing the idea. The book is called The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann. Okay. And he talks about, the process through which consciousness emerges, which he describes along the lines of mythology. Like, he basically shows how in mythology and in the development of mythology, what we see reflected is actually the development of consciousness, how consciousness emerges. He shows how that follows a certain pattern. There's a pattern through which consciousness emerges evolutionarily, and that's basically described in this mythological language, or it's reflected in this mythological language. Now, he also says that this is the way that consciousness evolved for us as a collective, so as a species. It's like this is how consciousness emerged over time, so to speak, or through this process, through this patterned process. And he says it's basically also synchronous to how consciousness develops in the individual. So the pattern through which consciousness emerges in an individual human being is actually the same pattern as how it emerged in us as a collective, as a species. And that's reflected in mythology. It's like encoded in mythology. You need to know how to read mythology. You need to know how to understand the symbols. But if you speak that language, then you can see how in mythology there's actually a description of this process. And this is where it gets interesting, because then the mythological language has certain capacities that you don't find in other forms of language, in language that's more analytical or sort of, a scientific language, for instance, which is sort of dry and fact-based descriptions of reality. A mythological language has different capacities or different affordances, you could say, in what it can describe, what it can delineate, or what picture it can paint, right? Now, I'm not going to be capable of summarizing the entire process, because then that's basically the content of the whole book. But there was one element of that that really stood out to me when I read it, and I was like, oh my God, this is genius. Because it, in a way, it encapsulates, it solves the problem, or it explains the problem, and it does that by an explanation that actually in itself is very paradoxical, feels very paradoxical. Yet when I read it, I was like, it's paradoxical, but this might actually be the best explanation that I've come across, because it's paradoxical. And the fact that it's paradoxical doesn't mean it's not true, doesn't mean it couldn't be true, because maybe reality is such that actually paradox is at the very core of it, and our existence is such that paradox is at the core of it. And this is where you kind of have to step out of this comfortable, scientific or sort of the philosophical mindset that we're very used to in the modern Western world, where we deny paradox. We see paradox as an indication that something is untrue, or we like things to be clear and objective and separated from each other, and like something is either true or not true. Something cannot be both true and not true
Also
at
part
the same
of
time.
the current paradigm, that rationalism, that kind of
Exactly.
that kind of methodology and epistemology, part of the paradigm, the current paradigm.
Yeah,
where that's
yeah,
like
yeah.
an absolute standard.
Yeah. So what the image that he offers up is as follows, and I'll just do my best to explain it. So bear with me. Basically, if you think about, before consciousness emerged in an individual or in us as a species, there's a period, so to speak, in history, but really, it's not exactly history. And I'll get to why that's the case. You could say like history, or, the past in itself is something that only exists to us as conscious beings. Like we have an idea of the past that exists in our minds, so to speak. The way that this is visualized in a mythopoetic language is like where we came from, our origin, our most primordial origin, is encapsulated by the symbol of the dragon eating its own tail. It's the dragon eating its own tail. Now, this is called the Ouroboros, and you see this in mythology, right? This is it's a very prevalent symbol. It's also used in alchemy, and it comes across in different traditions from different cultures. Now, the way that Erich Neumann explains this in Jungian language is that that's the pre-cosmogonic stage. Now, what does that mean? The cosmogenesis is the generation of the world, right? Coming into being of the world. The origination, like Genesis, comes from the root. You see the root back in the word generation. So Genesis is like the starting point, the birthing, the generation of the world. Cosmos, of course, is the known world, the ordered universe, the ordered world. So cosmogonic or cosmogenesis is the start of the world. So the pre-cosmogonic is whatever there was before that. Now you could say like, well, there was nothing. But in a way, there's not exactly nothing, because there is something, but that something is beyond conceptualization in a way. Yet it can be captured by a symbol, and that symbol is the dragon eating its own tail. It's the Ouroboros. And why is it this symbol? It's because, well, this symbol expresses something of like both and. It's like, it's both a distinct entity, but it's consuming itself. And in consuming itself, it's always dying and being born. It's like it's an impossible thing. It's something it's kind of like, it's hard to conceptualize. It's like it cannot be fully known because it's consuming itself. It's both knowing and the known, and it's both things at the same time. It's undifferentiated. It's also seen as chaos, right? It's the waters of chaos. It's the undifferentiated. It's the unmanifest. It's the unbegotten. Well, these are just words that are associated with it, but the main thing is the image. It's the symbol. It's actually, the symbol is the best way to express that. And you can use words to try and approximate it, but it's better to just see that symbol as a representation of that, because the symbol it works on your unconscious mind. There's a way that you can intuitively grasp the meaning of a symbol, which you cannot grasp rationally, or through language that is descriptive. So that's the pre-cosmogonic, right? That's at the very foundation of whatever there was out of which we emerged. And then there's this whole process from that to the point where consciousness emerged. And that has different phases. And those phases are also represented by different symbolic images. I'm not really going to go into that right now, but I think the origin is important. And then here we are. consciousness emerges, but through a process of basically differentiation. So consciousness emerges because it becomes more and more differentiated. And through this process of differentiation, it becomes contrasted with the unconscious. So consciousness emerges out of the unconscious, but in a way, it's also consciousness that creates the unconscious, because it's consciousness that defines what is unconscious. The unconscious isn't unconsciousness were it not for the fact that there is consciousness with which it's contrasted, right? So out of the Ouroboros, which is both conscious and unconscious, and it's also neither because it's sort of something completely other, there emerges consciousness in contrast with the unconscious. Now, within consciousness, as it emerges through this process, it comes into being, so to speak. It emerges. Then what he says is that, like, it's within consciousness then that the idea comes up of a history. You know, that evolutionary process through which consciousness emerged. It's as if there is like a process in time that unfolds. It's like there's an origin point that's beyond time, and then time unfolds. It's an evolutionary process that plays out, and then consciousness emerges. He's saying, like, yes, that's true, but that history that happens actually only happens when consciousness emerges retroactively. You know, it's like consciousness emerges, and then within consciousness, it's as if there was this history out of which consciousness emerges. That's the paradox, right? That's where it becomes impossible. It's like intuitively you say, like, well, how is it possible that the very process which produced consciousness only emerges when consciousness, you know, comes to enters the stage, so to speak. And yet he says, like, yet this is the way that it's expressed in this mythological language. This is the best way to understand it. Does it land like that, or does it need more elaboration?
Is he really?
What do you think?
It lands. It lands. Well, yeah, that's a lot, but it does land. But that's also, is it really all derived from the mythology? To what extent do you think that it really is derived just from human mythology, from the symbols?
Well, it's the mythology understood through this specific hermeneutic lens that basically suggests this model.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. I think, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I love how you're like, I'm just going to throw this one idea up, but it's like a whole 20-minute monologue explaining the origins of consciousness. But I mean, the Ouroboros, one thing that it made me think is this definition of God, which I love, which is that God is that which creates itself. Now, in the case of the Ouroboros, it's like it's eating itself. But there's some sort of similar thing there where it's paradoxical, because how can something create itself? It's like the universe or consciousness or reality itself. Like, where does it come from? Well, it creates itself. All other objects are created in a chain of cause and effect, except for the totality of existence, which is God, which creates itself. And that's what makes it God. It's that it's got this ability to do this. So kind of similar to the Ouroboros, except it's eating its own tail. It's like the destruction of itself by itself instead of the creation of itself by itself, I guess, which is interesting.
Well, it both consumes itself and it generates itself, you know?
Yes, right. Because it is itself eating itself. Does that mean that it eats itself and then it like nourishes itself and it like keeps growing?
Yeah, of course, because otherwise it would just eat itself and sort of destroy itself, but it doesn't do that. It's like it's in a loop of consuming itself and generating itself. Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it's consuming itself and getting sustenance from itself so that it can keep eating itself.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah. What kind of auto-cannibalism is that, dude? It's a cannibal's dream, dude. You can just eat your own self and you just regenerate.
Yeah.
But it does land. And I was thinking, as you were explaining the origin, the differentiation from the state before this, like, consciousness differentiates itself, that's also right in line with the kind of Vedantic view of the Godhead, Brahman, and then it separates into duality in separate forms into the world.
Yeah.
And also the idea of, I was thinking that how can it be this evolution of consciousness evolving? It's like, where does if you take the analytic idealism view, then everything is always consciousness. So what's the evolution? But there's really no contradiction there, because it would just be the evolution of human consciousness and personal human consciousness and egos, or the development of humanity. But consciousness as a generalized thing would already exist before humanity, but there would still be the story of human consciousness coming into being, which is a fascinating idea. And I'm definitely going to read this book now. Sounds very, very juicy. Those
you
are
mean
about
the
my thoughts on
origins
it.
and history of consciousness?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the final point about
Okay, do you want to? Yeah.
history.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I was going to say the final point about history being created the moment that there's consciousness, and it only kind of exists in the present to your consciousness.
Yeah.
That's also like
that's the
Alan
both
Watts.
and. It's like it's both the case that history produced consciousness, that this evolutionary process through time produced consciousness. That's true. But it's also true that consciousness produces that evolutionary process in a way, or contains within itself, gives birth to, makes aware, makes real in a way, makes real that very same process. So it's both and this is the paradox. How can both be true? And yet that's the idea. It's like, well, somehow, because that's the case,
Yeah, I think it would be, on a mystical level, it would be more true that consciousness creates history. And on another
I think it's
level,
both true
history
in a way.
creates consciousness. It is both
Exactly,
true.
that's the thing.
Yeah.
That's how it's sort of, that's weird and unsatisfying. It's like kind of upsetting, but for me, that it feels intuitively, some part of me says like, that's it. No?
Yeah. Nice. Awesome. Love that. Very, very interesting. I'm going to have to read this book now. I'm going to add it to the pile.
Yeah.
Add it to the list of books that need to be read. Yeah. Okay. Should we wrap it up
It's a
there?
great
I don't
book.
know how long
It's a
this
book
was.
that I remember I heard Ken Wilber saying once that he read this book like 5 times or something, and it really also informed his understanding.
Oh, well, I have to read it then. That's one of the best co-science that I could think of in the world of ideas.
Endorsement by Ken Wilber.
Yeah, even though he wears a wig.
And the fact that Carl Jung said, the fact that it's the book he always wanted to write but never managed to,
really,
is also important endorsements.
Wow. I thought that somebody said that
Jung
about
wrote
Jung.
the foreword also.
Jung said that himself.
No, Jung said that himself. Yeah, he wrote the foreword to the book also. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Anyway, you want to wrap things up? Maybe a concluding remark or a little recap about what we did now and what you want to do in maybe a follow-up episodes?
Yeah, sure. So we covered a lot of ground. I think the big headline here is that the current paradigm is changing. There's a paradigm shift going on. Maybe we didn't do enough to illustrate that by getting into the arguments, which are so difficult to argue for in the details. But there is a paradigm shift happening in science and academia. And I think generally people are opening up again to spiritual ideas, and this kind of spiritual aspect, the non-physical aspect of life, is more and more prevalent for a lot of people. And in philosophy of mind and science and academia more generally, there's these big trends that are happening, which are moving away from simplistic materialism and dualism. And this is the cutting edge of human thought. This is the cutting edge of academia and science and philosophy. So that's what we're doing. That's part of the mission statement of Age of Meaning, this podcast, is that we are interested in this thought, which is on the cutting edge, and we are working around that. We're thinking about that, and we are trying to advance the conversation and contribute to the conversation, which is pushing humanity forward in its understanding of reality in itself. That's part of the reason why we started this podcast. So on that note, next episode, we're going to be talking about part 3 that deconstructs the materialist paradigm, which is the issue of telepathy, near-death experiences, and out-of-body experiences. Now, what I titled this section as well in my notes is Spooky Action at a Distance, but for the Mind. So that's what this is about. It's spooky action at a distance, but mentally. Thoughts going across to another mind through the thoughts. So yeah, we're going to talk about that in the next episode. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Florian. And to our listeners, please like and comment and subscribe. If you listen to the end of this episode, please leave a comment. No one is commenting, and it helps us out a lot if you comment. So please leave a comment. And thank you so much.